Welcome to my presentation about the neurodiversity paradigm through the years. I will be giving a brief overview of the origins and history of the movement, and then I will talk about the present state of the movement and propose some issues that we might want to think further about. And some of that is going to be a bit opinionated, so I don't expect everyone to agree with me. I will be curious to see what everyone's opinion will be later on. But first, a content warning. As part of the discussion of the history, this talk mentions forced normalization, aversives, torture, and suicide. So please keep yourself safe if you need to. But this talk is recorded, and at some point we'll make it publicly available. So, just a slide. The first part about the history of the neurodiversity movement, and the book that you see here, Autistic Community and the Neurodiversity Movement, Stories from the Frontline, is highly recommended reading on this topic, and it's available for free online as well. So, and I've got a chapter in there about the bits that I'm going to talk about, and Lynne, a.k.a. Kaylin, has a chapter about Autscape, and there are, I think, about 20 others in there as well. So the history from lots of different perspectives. I will be giving the details later on. Now, an overview of the history. So long before neurodiversity, in the 1940s, Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger first described autism, and or they were one of the first. Anyway, they're generally considered the original autism narratives, although autism was also a part of schizophrenia long before that. They described autism, and they did this in terms of case studies. And case studies are basically a form of narrative. They're basically stories about the subject that they studied. And so, of course, Kanner and Asperger each got to shape their own narratives. They each put a slightly different emphasis on it, which is how we ended up with separate diagnoses of classic autism and Asperger's syndrome for a long time. However, the perspective of autistic people, the subjects being studied, sent from these narratives, was completely absent from these narratives. And to make matters worse, parents of autistic children were demonized early on, because psychoanalysts were blaming autism on cold and distant refrigerator mothers, which is a narrative that endured for decades. And as a reaction to that, parents started autism organizations to support each other, quite understandably. And then behaviorism came along. Applied behavioral analysis, ABA, seemed to show promise for the autistic children that the psychoanalysts had written off as hopeless. But if a child failed to be cured by that, then parents were still blamed for not working at it hard enough. So they subjected their children to more and more extreme and harsh therapy regimes at an ever earlier age, in the hope of saving their children before autism could snatch them. So ABA became a lucrative business whose practitioners were only too happy to provide. Thus, it is parental trauma and desperation that are what actually begat the notion of early intervention, which is not a good start. So, where's the autistic narrative in all this? It took the internet for autistic people to finally be empowered to insert their voice into these conversations. The early text-based internet not only overcame the fact that we were geographically and systematically isolated from each other, but also eliminated autistic difficulties with body language and other problems with face-to-face communication. There was no social media then. Starting a group of any description was difficult and generally required the support of a large organization. In 1992, parents of autistic children started the first online autism forum, the St. John's University Autism mailing list. Parents validated each other's experiences and viewpoints, supporting each other in trying to make their children as normal as possible. But then something interesting happened. One after another, autistic people started showing up in this community. This did not go very well. The parents mostly used autistic participants as resources or self-narrating zoo exhibits, to borrow a term from Jim Sinclair. And they considered communication between autistic people to be an annoying waste of bandwidth. Autistic members quickly started questioning and opposing the parents' ideas of an ideal treatment outcome. They basically said, we don't really want to be normal like you. Autism is a way of being that can be beautiful. We just want help with problems and barriers we face. Here is how we would have liked to be helped. Here are some ideas from an inside perspective on how to give your children a happy life. But most parents were dismissive. They thought that these internet people who claimed to be autistic were nothing like their children. Now, parents of autistic children previously blamed for their children's autism were already traumatized and entrenched and on the defensive. At the same time, autistic people also had a lifelong traumatic experience of being treated as less than human, institutionalized, etc., etc. So we had the perfect conditions for igniting a conflict that continues to this day. Now, the reaction of autistic people to that was to create Autistic Space. Fed up with being patronized, Jim Sinclair and others started the first autistic-run organization called Autism Network International. As of 1994, it ran its own university-supported discussion mailing list, ANIL, the ANIL list. This was the first online autistic space. Like in other communities in the disability rights movement, the people with the disability in question are in charge. But for autism, this was both new and radical. The community also invited what they called cousins, people with autism-like conditions or autistic-like experiences. ANI's inclusive term, autistics and cousins, foreshadowed the neurodiversity paradigm. And in 1996, ANI organized Autreat, which is Autscape's predecessor. It's the first conference for and by autistic. It took the idea of Autistic Space to the 3D realm, also known as real life, and changed many lives for the better. However, ANI wasn't quite everyone's cup of tea. Not every autistic person fit in there, although many did. It was, of course, wonderful to see people fit in there who did, but it was felt that an alternative was needed. However, starting your own group without any public facilities to do that was non-trivial at best. You had to host it yourself. I didn't have the support of a university, but as you can read in my chapter in the aforementioned book, there was an autistic man on the internet who really needed some help because he had serious behavior problems and he was being banned from everywhere, including the one Autistic Space, without any real effort being made to really even try to include him, which I thought was quite unfair. And I, as I said, felt the need for an alternative anyway, and as a computer programmer, I also had the experience to do something about it because I was able to run complex server software myself, even if I only had a dial-up phone line on which to do it. So I started self-hosting my own group, calling it Independent Living on the Autistic Spectrum, named after the independent living movement, which was part of the disability rights movement. Yeah, and I ran it between 1996 and 2012-ish, and some of its members came up with ideas that proved influential. For instance, the Australian sociologist Judy Singer and the American journalist Harvey Bloom jointly popularized the term neurodiversity. And Jane Meyerding, another one of the members, wrote an influential article called Thoughts on Finding Myself Differently Brained, that was first published on the INLD site, but can be found in many places now. maybe it is possible for me to post a few links in the chat for those who would like to follow along. Here we go. Right, so that's worth reading still, even if it was written in 1998. And several members also noticed that they were unable to recognize the faces of other people, a condition known as prosopagnosia that was obscure at the time. So INLV member Bill Shozer from San Francisco, who unfortunately died a few years ago, he wrote the first online book on the topic called Face Blind, which is also still available, and I've linked to it in the chat. And finally, someone you might know, known here as Kaylin, around that time, she was also a member, coined the term inertia, or autistic inertia, to describe this experience of getting stuck both in inactivity on the one hand and in activity on the other. Difficulty starting, but also difficulty stopping again once you've started. Basically after the physical concept of inertia, because a really heavy object, an object with a lot of mass, is difficult to get moving and also difficult to stop it moving again. Now, Kaylin herself has this problem, so it took a really long time. But she's done a few publications over the years, but not like a book. But now she has written a peer-reviewed paper on it, which I with 3 other authors, and I have linked that in the chat as well. It's called "No Way Out Except from External Intervention: First-hand accounts of autistic inertia." And this was based on research done at Autscape a few years ago, but the idea originated all back in the 90s on INLV and related groups. So it all goes way back. So 1996 to 98 was an extremely productive time in generating new ideas in what was to become the neurodiversity movement. So around 1998, developments on the internet finally made it easier for almost anyone to start their own groups. In 98, the public commercial list servers were opened where anyone could start their own discussion list. It was all still done through email, but there were web interfaces as well. And then websites with forums appeared, which dispensed with email altogether. Some of which became very big, like Wrong Planet, founded in 2004. And social media finally turned everything on its head, but I'll spare you that rant, don't really have time for it. But it's worth noting that other neurominorities also started taking note of the new neurodiversity paradigm and started applying it to their own communities, like people with ADHD or Tourette syndrome or dyslexia, or even people who stutter. And which is quite interesting. So in a few major events happened that really galvanized neurodiversity activism. In 2007 and 2009, a couple of very nasty campaigns, and this is where the content warning applies, received global attention. First, there was the Ransom Notes campaign in 2007, run by the New York University Child Study Center, and the I Am Autism advertisement from 2009 by Autism Speaks. Both of these portrayed autism and other neurodivergent conditions as monsters that kidnap normal children and hold them ransom, the mortal enemy of loving families everywhere. So basically, these were attempts to further prey on parental desperation. And they caused the neurodiversity movement to be further galvanized, along with an unending series of scandals of mistreatment in institutions, exemplified by the routine use of remote-controlled electric shock devices at the Judge Rotenberg Center in Massachusetts, USA, something that the UN condemned as torture, yet continues to this day. So, and they use a much higher powered shock than tasers, for instance. So it's actual torture, yet they manage to sell it as treatment. Yeah, but those are far from the only problems that happened. Institutionalization remains a massive problem, and in the UK, there have also been scandals of autistic people who have been unjustly institutionalized, and because of the maltreatment that they were subjected to, could not recover to become functional, which perpetuated their institutionalization, etc., etc. And people have also died as a result. And the neurodiversity movement is fighting this so far with not a lot of success, as far as I can tell. So that brings us to the present state and a few things that I'd like to propose for discussion as well. A few things that have come up. So first, here's a brief overview of the basic tenets of the neurodiversity paradigm. First of all, it's an aspect of biodiversity. So brains vary, as does everything else as biological, and this variation can be beneficial and is in fact essential to the survival of species. So neurodiversity is a natural and valuable form of human diversity. Neurological difference is not necessarily pathological, but the word necessarily is necessary here because not all neurological difference is good. Some neurological conditions are not even compatible with life. However, with autism, ADHD, dyslexia, etc., some abilities are enhanced as a result of the very same characteristics that can also be disabling. In other words, the good and the bad are often inseparable. Taking myself as an example, the same autistic feature that makes it difficult for me to engage in neurotypical social chit-chat also enhances my ability to be honest and truthful. The same autistic feature that makes me get mentally stuck a lot, unable to start an activity or stop one that I've already started, also makes it possible to dive more deeply into an area of interest than almost anyone else, without losing concentration or getting bored. If embraced, autistic features are a real source of potential. But this does not deny the reality of disability. The social model of disability states that disability results not only from impairments inherent to the person, but also from society's failure to adapt for those impairments. So, the notion of disability includes both those who feel primarily disabled by inherent impairments and those who feel primarily disabled by society's failure to include them because they are different. Either way, though, rights and power inequalities play into this. Autistic people and neurodivergent people in general are a minority in society that frequently suffers from being systematically disadvantaged and discriminated against. So the neurodiversity movement falls squarely within the disability rights movement, or at least should do. So, in summary, the neurodiversity paradigm is the radical notion that humans who are different are human and are entitled to the same human rights as anyone else. But in order to know that any of this applies to us, we first have to discover that we're neurodivergent in some way in the first place. And since the 1990s, many people have been discovering this about themselves on the internet. Myself, I've spent an entire childhood and some of my adulthood not knowing I was autistic, so finding out that other people like me exist was a profound and life-changing experience. I read not just the diagnostic criteria, but especially also articles written by other autistic people, finding that I could relate to them like nothing else. This is called self-diagnosis. It's very important and valid, but also risky, because diagnosis is complex and fraught with pitfalls and easy to get wrong. So, many communities, especially medical ones, are against self-diagnosis and think we should leave diagnosis to the experts. But is that really better? Autism experts are mostly not autistic. They have book knowledge, and hopefully they will also have indirect experience from working with autistic people, but what they will never have is the internal direct experience of being autistic. In addition, the way these conditions are diagnosed is still very problematic. The diagnostic criteria are based on outward behavior and not on actually experienced problems. And the distinctions between one condition and another are quite arbitrary and often more determined by historic and political factors than anything else. So really, official diagnosis is at least as problematic as a self-diagnosis until a better way of diagnosing is devised, which I don't see happening anytime soon. I think we should not care too much about any of this. It is more useful to identify your concrete needs and try to get support for those. A diagnosis can still be an important key that opens the door to the information you need to meet these needs and the services, of course, and to find a community of peers that can support you. And another problem with diagnosis is, as it is currently done, is that there is evidence that autism, as currently defined by the DSM-5, is not really a single thing. It may be multiple conditions with multiple causes. In 2016, Waterhouse, London and Gilbert published an open access study called ASD Validity that concluded this by saying the ASD diagnosis lacks biological and construct validity. They're not saying it doesn't exist. They're saying the definition as currently used is wrong. What should be done about it is not yet clear, and we should be very wary of dividing our community with arbitrary distinctions. That is a mistake that's already been made before with the false distinction between autism and Asperger's syndrome, and we should not repeat this. At the same time, even though the subcategories of autism are not yet known, we should remain open to the possibility that they exist, and that what is true for one autistic person may not be true for another. For instance, for most of us, autism very much feels like part of who we are, and we would not want to change who we are to fix our problems. But there are also autistic people for whom autism feels like something they have, something separate from who they are, and they are currently not really represented in the neurodiversity movement because we have pretty much been rejecting them. Even so, there is also evidence that autistic people often process things in similar ways despite pronounced differences in communication and cognitive abilities. So as different as we all are from each other, there appears to be something fundamentally similar about the way we communicate. For instance, we tend to be more direct, and we tend to say what we mean and mean what we say, unlike neurotypicals. The timing of our communication is also different. We tend to be less fast-paced and need more time for processing. So there is a clear need for the autism label, at least for the time being, so that we can find each other. And in any case, it will continue to exist as long as people continue to identify with it. So there is something like an autistic culture or subculture based on our shared communication characteristics. It's comparable with deaf culture, where this is much more clear. Their shared communication is sign language. Our communication commonalities are more subtle than that, but just as real. It's easier for autistic people to communicate with each other than with non-autistic people. But does this really include all autistic people? Are we including everyone who needs to be included communication-wise? I don't think we are. We're still not managing to reach most non-speaking autistic people, or those who have cognitive disabilities or are seen as being severely disabled. Many of them live with their families or in institutions and never discover that Autscape exists. They cannot really access all the information that's on the internet. We somehow need to do better at reaching them and including them. Unfortunately, I don't really have solutions to this problem, as it really is quite difficult, but we need to keep thinking about it and trying. I'm open to ideas and suggestions. Another thing is that the neurodiversity movement does not include people who want to be cured, who don't like their autism. As I've mentioned, Autism is not really one thing, and clearly there are variants of autism where people who have it actually feel like they have it. They are not it. They experience it as something separate from their personhood, something with not much positive about it, and some of them even wish for a cure. Right from the beginning, in 1992, the autism rights movement rejected these people, and the neurodiversity movement still does. I think that's wrong. Yes, we should totally advocate for everything we've already been advocating for. Autism acceptance, pride, rights, etc. But that should not come at the cost of rejecting people who have a different experience of autism. They too would benefit from having rights. And no one is more in need of acceptance than those who cannot accept themselves. I believe that the entire autistic and neurodiversity communities would benefit from more respect for personal choice and personal difference. Some of us want to change, some of us don't. Both should be fine. I've noticed an interesting discrepancy here as well. Many in the autistic community are trans, and trans people who want to transition from one sex/gender to another are completely accepted. Any claims that these people should simply accept themselves as they are rightly rejected as transphobic. Yet, we reject a person with autism who feels that their autism is not who they are and who wants to transition from autistic to neurotypical. Never mind that it's impossible, we're rejecting them for simply desiring this. Why? So, autism is not one single thing, but somehow the diversity bit of neurodiversity seems to have been forgotten along the way. Or have we become too conformist? Or maybe we always have been. Right. Some other things is that the neurodiversity movement is still mostly isolated from other disability rights movements, and that is also a problem because they don't really understand us and we don't really understand them. The disability rights movement is still mostly led by people with physical disabilities, wheelchair users, deaf people, blind people, but does not very much include neurological differences yet. And so I think we could benefit from having a lot more connections with them, from reaching out to them and from them reaching out to us. And that might also give us more experience with actually practicing the diversity bit of neurodiversity. Another thing is that the neurodiversity movement is mostly English speaking. It's mostly happening in English speaking countries. And so, one of the things is that, we're always saying that most autistic people, the vast majority, like identity first language. But this is actually not true in every country. In English-speaking countries, most people like to say, I am autistic. But, for instance, in the Netherlands, most people say, I have autism. So, and this varies from country to country. Experiences vary from country to country. And I think that's interesting and should be explored further. Another thing is that the neurodiversity movement is quite white. There's not a lot of inclusion of people of other colors and or other ethnicities, and I think that needs to be addressed as well. I think we should be better at actively reaching out to these people and including them and giving them a platform, because somehow they don't manage to find their way to us, and it might be that in some way that I don't understand because I'm quite white myself, as you can see, but it might be that in some way we're not being completely welcoming or inclusive to them. So let's reach out to them and listen to what they have to say. And finally, the neurodiversity movement, as it currently is now, is based in part on notions designed for and by neurotypical activist communities. And well, that in many ways that's a good thing. We've based many things on, for instance, the gay pride movement, which became a more generalized pride movement. So, right, first, identity is really important here, because identifying as autistic, making that part of your identity, helps in understanding yourself, and it helps particularly in accepting yourself. Another social justice notion is the notion of the ally, the neurotypical person, or the person who's not part of our community but who fights for our rights on our side, and who basically helps us communicate our needs, our opinions, and what we want and need from society to society at large. Another very important notion is the notion of intersectionality, which is the recognition that there are multiple ways of being disadvantaged, and that you can be disadvantaged in multiple ways at once. For instance, you can be both autistic and black, both autistic and trans, both autistic and mentally ill, etc., or any combination of basically anything. And pride is also fantastic. It's very much needed because basically for our entire lives, most autistic people have been told that we're wrong in the very way that we exist, right? So it's a small step from acceptance to pride, and pride can be a good counterweight against being told that you're wrong as a person all your life, because permission to be proud of who you are. I think it's necessary. And finally, the notion of safe space. It's a space where it's safe to be yourself. That's very important, and a space where your trauma triggers are respected, and that is also important. But there are problems with these because none of these things were actually thought up by autistic people for autistic people. And do these notions need de-neurotypicalizing to include all autistic people? For instance, autistic people thrive on honesty, right? On direct, honest feedback. Now, as I've said before, self-diagnosis is super important, but like all diagnosis, it can also be a bit risky, and people are capable of being wrong, including about themselves, but it's apparently not allowed to say that. It's not allowed to say, like, are you really sure that you have or are this thing, or maybe it's more like this or that. You can, if you say I identify as this or that, it's more or less sacred, and it precludes the possibility of getting honest feedback, and that may limit self-understanding. Like, we're all people and everyone needs a reality check sometimes, and that I would rather get that reality check from trusted autistic friends than from your random neurotypical who doesn't really understand me. But I'm not about to get any, because in modern social justice notions that's not really allowed. The notion of allies can also be quite condescending, because allies are not really allowed to have viewpoints of opinions on their own. They're supposed to channel ours, after all, which means that allyship can also attract somewhat problematic people, some people who are in it to help us, not for altruistic reasons, but to gain from it somehow, or to feel better about themselves, to deal with their own inferiority complex, and this is how you can get white knight saviors and virtue signalers and that kind of people, and it can get quite toxic, really. For instance, there's quite a prominent popular website that is run by an ally called The Thinking Person's Guide to Autism, but there are autistic people who have experienced being censored and told off by this person, by this neurotypical ally that runs it, and I don't think that's right. So personally, I think that the notion of a friend is more useful, because a friend is someone who has your back, who will fight for you, but who can Also, you know, you can also still have an honest conversation with, and who can even call you out on your own BS if necessary. And intersectionality, the notion of intersectionality does not always recognize that different needs can conflict. It's probably the least problematic of all these notions, because it's common sense that people can be oppressed in multiple different ways. But you know, for instance, someone's need to avoid certain trigger words due to trauma may conflict with an autistic person's linguistic communication difficulties, or with the verbal tic of a person with Tourette's. And the only way to deal with this is to accept this, and for everyone to take responsibility for maintaining their own boundaries and safety, which is what we do at Autscape. And then there's pride. Pride is brilliant, but it can also be patronizing, because when everything that an autistic person does is super wonderful and fantastic because they're autistic, that, you know, it sort of means you're also not really being taken seriously as a person. Personally, I would want honest feedback on what I do. I don't like being told that everything I do is fantastic, because I know that not everything I do is fantastic, and I want to be better. And I have found that, you know, in the autistic community, it used to be quite easy to get honest feedback, but it's getting harder now, I find. And especially when you know, this is doubly true for children, but you know, even children need to hear how they could be better, or including autistic children. Kaylin, who is a co-founder of Autscape, wrote a blog post about this once on her own personal blog, which was perhaps read by 3 people. And but the leader of a Pride event found out about this and sent a lynch mob after her for, you know, basically criticizing this kind of patronizing thing. And so, you know, and that's another example of how pride can also be unsafe, because there are just certain things you're not allowed to say. And I think that's not very autistic compatible. And the same is true for safe spaces. You know, is Autscape a safe space? I was asked this question the other day, and the answer is kind of complicated. Because there are basically 2 ways of being a safe space. There's an old one and there's a new one. And the old one is this: a safe space is a space where no one will judge you or harm you for being yourself. This is what Autscape is. Autistic people cannot be themselves almost anywhere else, and Autscape gives us a few days where we can be ourselves in a community of others who are more or less like us, or who at least share the experience of being different. So many of us have never experienced this in our lives before Autscape, so it's fundamental to Autscape and will not change. But it does mean you have to put up with people or opinions you don't like, or that may even be unsafe for you. Sometimes 2 people are unsafe for each other and have to stay out of each other's way. It's pretty rare, but it's been known to happen. We practice the presumption of competence. We assume that everyone is competent to manage their own boundaries, or otherwise to ask an organizer for help, or to bring their own support people with them. So this is an autistic conceived way of doing a safe space, one we inherited from Autism Network International's Autreat event and have been developing since. The new way of doing a safe space is different. This is the one imported from neurotypical social justice movements. It basically means we will keep you safe from opinions or people that you find disagreeable or triggering. This means you are made responsible for everyone else's triggers, which makes you very vulnerable to being lashed out at, and worse, by traumatized people. You're expected to avoid offending easily offended people, even accidentally. For example, my partner Kaylin got kicked out of an autistic group for being too logical and responding to arguments instead of feelings. And in my view, that is an anti-autistic, ableist action. So the modern safe space notion is the opposite of healthy boundaries, a new social minefield for autistic people to navigate. And there are some multiply disabled autistic advocates such as Mel Baggs who have written about feeling particularly unsafe in safe spaces like this and have in fact been harmed in them. Now, Autscape is not that kind of safe space and never will be, because it's that kind of safe space. Basically, no one is safe to be themselves. So, the next issue is identity. And it's an interesting and complex one for me, because I lived for 2 decades and more and a few years without an autistic identity, yet I was still autistic. So for me, I'm quite keenly aware that it's possible to be autistic without having an autistic identity, right? And I still had the corresponding needs of an autistic person, and I still had my rights as a human being violated by not having those needs met and by being, bullied, etc., etc.
So interrupt, but 25 minutes have passed.
Okay, thank you. So then I found out I was autistic, and the fact of being autistic became embedded in my sense of identity. Yet I still wouldn't say that I identify as autistic, because to me it's just a fact that's always been, regardless of whether I identify as such or not. But identity politics is basically the notion that we should have certain rights based on what we identify as. So how about those who won't identify or cannot, because they don't know, for instance? And, lately there's been criticism of biological essentialism, but neurodiversity is based on biological essentialism. We are different because our brains are. Does that not make identity irrelevant to the question of rights? And shouldn't our rights be derived from our needs instead? And those are, questions for discussion. This one, right? Right, and then there's the notion of disability. There's widespread agreement, especially in the English-speaking world, that autism is a disability. I find quite a few autistic people in the non-English speaking world who don't think they're disabled, but I think they're kind of getting it wrong what a disability is, particularly because they're not aware of the social model of disability. Now, I won't go deeply into what the social model and the medical model are, but I think I've gone into that anyway. But a problem with them is that all models have limited validity, so there's always the risk of over-applying them. And in 1976 there was a statistician called George Box, and he was writing about statistics, but I think it's more widely applicable, and he basically said all models are wrong, but some are useful. And given what I've said before, I think the medical model has of course been extremely over-applied, but that doesn't mean it's not useful when applied correctly. And with respect for the individual's rights, needs, wants, etc. And the same is true for the social model. It is usually taken to an extreme as well. This is not really the correct theory of it, but many people take the social model as all disability is society's fault, and if society were perfect at accommodating all disabilities, there would be no such thing as a disabled person. I don't agree with that, because I personally experience impairments that are not possible to accommodate externally. For instance, there are times every day where I'm unable to act on my own intentions due to a pretty serious case of autistic inertia, which Caitlin has described. So you can only go so far with accommodating that, and I think that needs to be recognized as well. Is it possible to be autistic without being disabled? That's an interesting question, and I'm not going to answer this right now. I would like to save that for the Discord. I'm interested in what you all have to say about that. masking is another common issue, and the need to mask is an oppression. And if you are forced to mask all day, every day, if you're never allowed to be yourself, it's massively damaging. But we also have to remember that there are autistic people who are not capable of masking in the first place, and they experience completely different problems. And they're much more likely to be institutionalized, for instance, or subjected to forced treatment, forced psychiatric treatment, or having their rights taken away by being put under conservatorship, for instance. And as damaging as masking is, that can also protect you from all that. So it can be simultaneously an oppression and also a privilege. And don't get me wrong, I know that masking can be massively damaging. I'm just pointing out that there's this other side of it as well. So how do we implement neurodiversity at Autscape? Autscape is like an experiment in practical neurodiversity that has been running for 16 years. So here's what we found that works best. We designed it for autistic needs, and autistic people are in charge, but we then welcome everyone in it, regardless of identity or diagnosis or self-diagnosis. We don't even ask who is autistic and who is not, because we want to include everyone. We want to include people who are questioning. We want to include people who cannot or don't want to identify or disclose that they're autistic. We want to be open to the possibility that even someone who thinks they're perfectly neurotypical discovers that they might well be autistic when they find that they completely fit into this community. And we want to give neurotypicals the possibility, those who respect our space, we want to give them the possibility to learn from us as well, and to, and we want to give them the opportunity to feel sort of, or even very uncomfortable in an environment that they don't fit into. That's been some of the very interesting things that I've experienced at Autscape. We see a few neurotypical people every year who don't, in the real life Autscapes, who don't fit in. And I'm like, welcome to my life. And I think that's good for them, and that's an experience that I want them to share, because with their friends and all that, because it gives them more empathy with us. And and for reasons I've explained, it's not a safe space, with quotes, like in that new sense. It is a safe space in the sense you can be yourself and you're not going to be judged or harmed for it. When autistic people stop, typo there, that should say masking, not making. When autistic people stop masking, you encounter not only recognition, but also disagreement and different viewpoints, right? I've been through this. And intersectionality is necessary. We need to be as intersectional as we possibly can, but not at the expense of autistic needs, because Autscape does need to stay an autistic space where autistic needs come first and foremost. Otherwise, it will be something different. That's where autistic people won't fit in so well. Right, so what has the neurodiversity movement achieved so far? Societal awareness of the fact that it exists. Today on Twitter, I saw a tweet that insulted Dominic Cummings, the Brexit politician, calling him this poor neurodiverse child because he lives in this delusional world. Well, you can, it's bad when our terms are used as slurs, but it also means, okay, now we've arrived in the mainstream, right? People are aware, for better or worse. So societal awareness, we've achieved that, and we've achieved a widening of diagnostic criteria. People are now diagnosed who previously wouldn't have been, because we've eliminated some of those horrible stereotypes from the diagnostic process. We've achieved participatory autism research. That's a big thing now. Autistic people started to participate in autism research, often still as tokens, but it is progress. And some autistic people, such as my partner, Kaylin, are now even leading research. And there have been campaigns against institutionalization and maltreatment and abuse and torture in institutions, but unfortunately there's been no great success yet there. And we've achieved small islands of accessibility in society. We've created some niches where autistic people and other neurodivergent people fit in and can work and get a job and all that. So, my conclusions. We need to include a greater diversity of disability and functioning levels and viewpoints on autism in our movement, in my view, right? We need to be better about including racial and ethnic minorities. We need to cultivate healthy boundaries and productive ways to deal with disagreement. And we need to figure out for ourselves how to do that in an autistic compatible way. We need more empathy with parents and carers, even your typical ones, because they too have been traumatized. This is actually a point I made in the history part, which I've not, repeated today, but I made that point Friday. Because if we can empathize with them, then they'll empathize more with us, and they can become friends/allies. And in spite of all our disagreements, in spite of all the different ways that we see things, I think the vast majority of autistic people can agree on a few unifying goals, which is full representation and participation in society for autistic people, and that we autistic people should basically be in charge of our own affairs. We need support and accessibility to accommodate for our disabilities in society, and most of all, we need our basic human rights respected. All autistic people need the freedom to choose to live their life in the way they see fit, and there are way too many of us, especially those seen as more severely disabled, who don't have that basic human right, and where other people make all the decisions for them, and we need to become allies to them, those of us who have more freedom. So, right, that's it. To read more, I highly recommend this book, which I'll